Everyone got quiet all of a sudden. As if we're like getting started or something. We have like 2 minutes. I just want to make sure. Yes, ma'am. Well, and also we are giving away free copies of the book. We told folks that the first 25 to show up in person actually get a free copy, and they're there on the table. So feel free to like hop up and grab a copy of the book. It is an amazing book. I'm super excited to talk about it today. But yeah, feel free to take like a minute to do that, and then we'll kind of give folks online a chance to kind of log in, log on. So.
I'll take one at the end with everybody.
Excellent. I think we're about ready to get started. And so I want to say, first of all, just welcome everyone. We are super excited to be here tonight on behalf of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Northeastern University. We're here at the Arlington campus today to actually introduce one of our professors and her latest book. And I'm super excited to have Professor Mai'a K here to talk about our book, as well as we're going to have 3 folks who are going to be providing a critical review of her book, which is called International Cooperation Against All Odds, the Ultrasocial World. And our 3 guests tonight are Divyansh Kaushik from the Federation of American Scientists, Esther Brimmer from Council on Foreign Relations, and Gloriela Iguina-Colón, who is from C40 Cities. So welcome. And to get us started, I'm going to have our regional dean, Jamie Jones-Miller, who is the person who put together this magnificent campus. She's going to welcome you and give you a couple of opening remarks. Go ahead, Jamie.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Dr. Corley. We really appreciate you making time to come to Northeastern and to the Arlington campus this evening. A couple years ago, I did something crazy, and I left the only career I had ever known, working on Capitol Hill and at the Department of Defense in the national security space day to day, to come work for Northeastern University to launch a campus here in the National Capital Region focused on the intersection of technology and innovation and security and policy. So you can see why I was so thrilled to have the opportunity to work with this team to host this particular event today, because this topic really is at the heart of what we are doing here at the Arlington campus and in the National Capital Region. Also, a particularly interesting day, as you're flipping through your book, please make sure to read part 3 on space exploration, because in about 22 minutes, we hope to have the lunar lander successfully land on the moon at 6:24 p.m. And that is a particular expertise in a set of Dr. Cross, and she may touch on some of that today. So thank you very much for making time to join us. For those of you who are joining us virtually, we are so happy to have you in our virtual room for this event tonight. And thank you to the entire team who made this possible. I'm really looking forward to taking some notes. So back over to you. Thank you, Dr. Corley.
Thank you so much. I also want to say thank you so much to the Center for International Affairs and World Cultures, who is a co-sponsor of tonight's event. It just so happens that I'm an affiliate of the center, as well as Regional Dean Jamie is actually on the advisory council. And of course, Professor Mai'a K is the director of the center. And so just to give you a little bit of background about the center itself, it is we call it a center, but it's really a community that draws on Northeastern's main strengths in the study of international institutions and processes, enhancing knowledge of the world societies, politics, and cultures. So the center seeks to enrich and support scholarship and timely analysis on how fostering international cooperation, empathy, and mutual understanding have contributed and can contribute to solving major global challenges. And the center accomplishes this in 3 primary ways. First, by hosting timely conversations like this one for faculty and students across the global network. Second, by serving as a resource and idea incubator for scholars across the university. And third, by providing analysis accessible to the broader community. The center bridges theory and practice in the humanities and the social sciences to deepen policy-oriented expertise and encourage global public engagement. As I mentioned, I'm an affiliate of the center, and I'm super excited to actually welcome Mai'a here to discuss her latest book, which I mentioned is International Cooperation Against All Odds, The Ultrasocial World. I am super excited about this book because it really does challenge global assumptions about what international relations are, and it actually challenges us to be thinking about what you term in the book empathic cooperation, and how because of humanity's innate tendencies towards ultrasociality, we have alternative pathways that help us kind of avoid the conflicts that we see dominating the news headlines so much today. And so we're going to get started by having a kind of one-on-one conversation between Mai'a and I to kind of like just talk a little bit about the book, to explain the concepts, to talk about why this and how this book came about. And then we're going to open up to our discussants here to kind of give us their critical lens on how this can actually be applied to policymaking at the international, national, and local levels. So I'm going to have a seat and get all the stuff off my chair and sit down and have this conversation with Mai'a. So, okay, I had like 50 questions for Mai'a, but we don't have that much time, so I'm going to try to keep it to 5. And I'm going to start by asking, what is ultrasociality and why is it so controversial, especially in international relations?
Thank you. Thanks very much for the question. Thanks everyone for coming. It's my pleasure to discuss the book with you. And I think what I would say to answer your question is that most of international relations scholarship and policy is premised on the assumption that we as humans are competitive, we are self-interested, we are power-driven, we are sort of aiming for things that could cause violence or could lead to violence and so forth. However, the actual science about human nature in the last 10 or 20 years has said otherwise. It's actually shown across many different disciplines. Some of the works that I address in the book are cognitive psychology, social neuroscience, human evolutionary biology, ecology, and so forth. They're all kind of pointing to the fact that we as a species are sort of drawn to cooperation, that we have empathy, that we even have altruism, that, actually we are socially minded, we have a social brain. And so when I looked at all of this literature from these other disciplines, I was thinking about how in international relations we typically start with the opposite assumptions, and I thought, how can we scale up this newish understanding of human nature so that it's relevant to understanding how international relations works, or as you said, so that in some way we can capitalize on this tendency basically to have better outcomes in international relations.
Well, it's interesting because, you are familiar with my research that I did in Germany, where they consider social capitalism and social democracy as a backbone. So the social always kind of comes first. And so kind of seeing kind of the biology, the natural sciences, the physical sciences behind that tendency to always want to be social, I found it very interesting. So how did you kind of come up with this concept?
Yeah, it was an interesting process. Actually, all of my other books in some way draw out themes of international cooperation, whether it's diplomacy, public diplomacy, mutual understanding, societal reaction to existential crises, such as in the European context. So I'm kind of building my record as this cooperation scholar in effect. And I was thinking, I'm still up against the dominant assumptions in this field. They sort of hold the high ground in terms of explaining international relations. And I question whether that should actually be the case. So as I discovered this literature, I dug deeper and then kind of started looking at many, many different types of scientific findings. It was interesting to find that, actually we might be starting from the wrong place. That we need a kind of, if this science is so compelling and it's converged on this kind of finding of human empathy and sociality, that we need a paradigm shift in how we look at international relations, and we have to start with the ultrasocial. Now, I'm not saying that this means the world is a utopia. I see all of the violence and the war and the failures, right? But I think even with those realities, starting with an ultrasocial lens allows us to understand pathways to improve upon this. I think some of our thinking has kind of been integrated into institutions, and so there is a self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic to some of the conflict that we're seeing. But even in the worst of times, you actually can see ultrasociality in the reaction to the violence of dictators or in reaction to tribalism. And ultimately, ultrasociality can explain tribalism as well, which I'm seeing as kind of the opposite outcome.
Well, actually, you kind of touch upon it, this tribalism component, because I think about like our programs here. I teach in public policy and urban affairs, and our programs are really centered on understanding behavioral sciences as a foundation for policymaking. And, the hardest thing to teach are the things around empathy and emotional intelligence and the things that really relate to the, human interactions, because, what is policy but a study of human interactions? But tribalism and individualism are two things that you identify in the book as forces that kind of demonstrate our ability to be able to take, or actually the ability of narcissistic, sometimes psychopathic, but charismatic leaders to be able to take our ultrasocial nature and redirect that to divide us, to get us in, put us in conflictual situations. Can you talk a little bit more about specifically tribalism, but the ways in which our ultrasocial nature can be misused? Sure,
yeah. So obviously the aim of the book is to spotlight outcomes of cooperation, because I do argue that they've been under spotlighted. And in fact, we tend to focus on violence and war, and when things don't work out, bad news sells. But at the same time, I have a treatment of tribalism in the beginning of the book that essentially says that, there are ways in which manipulative leaders can kind of sway publics into thinking they're going to join something, to belong to something bigger than themselves, that sort of draws them in by their ultra-social inclinations. But then there's actually a sinister part to this, in that the aim of these movements is often us versus them. And before too long, the followers do actually realize this, that it isn't a path towards kind of building empathy. It is actually about kind of focusing on how things go wrong and how there are people that you're kind of fighting against. And so I think if we really look at the larger span of human history, oftentimes these types of movements that are actually based on tribalism fail.
And so it's kind of interesting kind of thinking about tribalism, because one of the things, and this is actually a question that I thought about and didn't actually write down, so this is question number 51. Thinking about some of the pieces, and it kind of goes into another question I have, about the role of ideas and imagination in the work that we do. So for example, our programs are really focused in on experiential learning, of making sure we're bringing real world projects into the classroom, especially in service of the communities and places where we have a footprint, like here in the National Capital Region in Metro DC. And in that process, we talk a lot about asset-based approaches, of where instead of us talking about, oh, these poor communities, they really need our help, really talking about what the assets are in those communities. And so your book does a really fantastic job of repositioning the way that we're thinking about human relations, instead of like conflict, of thinking about it from a standpoint of abundance and optimism. Can you talk a little bit more about the role that ideas and imagination play?
Right, yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question, because even though I'm starting with ultrasociality, that is kind of, in a way, an underlying structure or an ontology in a more scholarly way of putting it. But you have to get from ultrasociality to outcomes in international relations. There's a challenge there in building theory and causal explanations for that. And so in that second part of the book, what I really advance is one type of theory to build off of this ultrasociality, and that is the power of ideas. The power of possibility that can tap into our ultrasocial inclinations. And the cases are space, nuclear weapons, the European integration project, and climate change. So I trace how really transformational, optimistic ideas that kind of bring a new narrative of hope can actually galvanize people around the power of possibility and form transnational and international societal movements that are strong enough to actually convince governments to change their position or take on a new position. So this is just one example of how you can sort of see ultrasociality at work, I think. But ideas are crucial. Human beings have curiosity and imagination, as you mentioned. And if that's nurtured in society through education and institutions, that helps down the road with breakthroughs, ideas for cooperation on a grand scale. And one thing I really emphasize, even though there is this kind of sort of tendency that we have that scientists are telling us about, we have an agency, right? We choose what to do with that. And that's incredibly important. Nothing is agency as to what we do. And that's when ideas really do become very important.
And it's really important to understand the role that ideas play just in everything, in our society. So I remember, I was very fortunate to actually learn from Jens Beckert, who's a scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne. And while I was there, actually released a book called Imagined Futures, talking about the role that imagination and ideas play in capitalism. You can't have capitalism without having ideas. And I think that we're at a position where the ideas that we have are so deficit and scarcity focused. They're so negative. They are so focused in on very narrow conflictual concepts where our moral and social imagination is very, very small. And so, so it's great to kind of have a kind of a reframing to get us to be thinking a little bit more positively, to be thinking more about abundance, to be thinking more about cooperation and collaboration and the role that empathy and things like that kind of play.
Right. Yeah, I think, so one possibility of being kind of lured away from our ultra-social tendency is tribalism. But another possibility is just a shortage of leadership and ideas and sort of will to kind of engage in things that could result in change. So I think it is incredibly important to think about, transformational ideas that have worked in the past, as I do in the book, and what those could be in the future. So in the book, I talk about the European Federalist idea, which was so groundbreaking, turning away from national sovereignty in order to create what would become the European Union, or the spaceflight idea, thinking of space as for all humankind, that we can go there and use it peacefully and it's for the betterment of all. Or the non-use idea behind the nuclear weapons taboo, which was fundamentally tied to peace, a positive sense of what was possible. And then the climate change net zero idea. Again, this isn't just a technical scientific standard. It's actually an idea of a better future that can include economic development and bring countries in the global south along with it.
So, I think, I want to ask 20 more questions, but I have to ask just one more question before we kind of turn it over to our discussants to kind of talk about their perspectives. But thinking about the role that this kind of the conversations, the dialogues that we have, my research in Germany was looking at the discourse, was looking at parliamentary transcripts, looking at, magazine and news articles and the way people were talking about things, to be able to understand kind of how ideas were kind of coming to the fore to regulate illegal work. And so as you kind of thinking about the actors that are out there, the media, other people who are kind of controlling or helping to direct the public narrative, kind of how can we infuse, do you see, ultrasociality into all these things? And I would also be very interested in hearing what else should we have, would you have liked to have covered in this book that you didn't get a chance to cover? So yeah.
That sounded like at least two questions. No, but I think, I obviously can't execute the ideas of this book all by myself. So I think the idea would be to try to just get more people, especially policymakers and practitioners, to realize this capacity, and then to start thinking about their own specific areas of policy, how you might turn this understanding into actual tools to kind of, it starts at the level, as you said, inspiring curiosity and imagination, particularly, I think, through the liberal arts, this kind of which is actually a prerequisite for empathy and ultrasociality. You have to have a sense of self to have empathy. But also, just thinking about how you can continually have longer term mutual engagement across society, even when you have countries that don't necessarily get along. We saw this in the Cold War, finding pockets of ways that you can cooperate. The Soviet Union and the US actually had a joint moon landing plan, and they were about to move forward with this plan. Unfortunately, JFK was assassinated later that month, but the space agencies had signed on to it. So I think really opening up the power of possibility idea, creating a context and institutions for people to flourish in this way, the mutual engagement across borders at all times, at all levels, and thinking about the narratives that we put forward. Do we have to talk about space race? Or can we talk about peaceful endeavor that must be done cooperatively?
Thank you. All right. So with that, I'm actually going to now turn it over to our discussants because, I absolutely love this book. But let's see what our discussants have to say. So I'm going to actually start with Esther Brimmer. And by the way, the bios for everyone up here is on your chair. So I'm not going to go into reading the bios. But as someone who has had a very distinguished career in multiple areas, as well as has collaborated, I think, climate change as well as on space diplomacy, along with Professor Cross here. I would love to hear your thoughts about the book and what it means in terms of international policy making.
Well, first, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this evening. I'd like to extend my hearty congratulations to Professor Cross. This is an outstanding book. You've made a great contribution both to scholarship and to diplomacy. So I look forward to your ideas spreading far and wide, both with our conversation this evening, our conversation online, and many conversations in the future. So well done. Thank you for bringing this book to all of us. In my comments, I'll focus a bit more particularly on some of the international relations aspects and on particularly with a particular reference to the space aspects as well. Now, we are getting close. In fact, the lander should be landing any moment now. But to say, first off, that if we think about from the scholarship point of view, that you provide a richer way of thinking about the power of possibilities. And so I pulled out some of my favorite quotes from the book to start our conversation. One was to talk about our ultrasocial predisposition is visible through the narratives within the societal movements, reasons given for choosing some ideas over others. That idea that we do have agency, we do have a choice about which ideas, which policies we pursue. Another comment that I particularly liked to quote was, and I do have my footnotes in here, people want the footnotes. we always have our citations. The resilience of the human spaceflight idea has anchored us all in the dream of scientific discovery, cooperation, and the power of possibility. And so that was the quote I wanted to say just about now, as we probably are hopefully successfully landing the most recent U.S. lander on the moon first in 50 years. And I think that power of possibility is a phrase that you give to us as we think about international relations. Also, that your work provides us some alternatives to classic international relations theory. So just to recall, if we think about the great movements, we think about one about realist theory, which focuses particularly on power and the nature of states being one adversarial one. We go, of course, all the way back to Thomas Hobbes and others when we think about this. Again, a often cited and often the premise for much of our approach to international relations. We can think about the liberal internationalist school, and I suppose I probably fall into this area, that talks about mutual or shared interests and allows for a space to cooperate, but you go a step farther. We can think about the communitarian approach, and Professor Etzioni and others who have looked at reasons for cooperation. But I think giving us the concept of ultrasociality gives us a more coherent and integrated way of thinking about why people cooperate in the international sphere. So I think that concept would be powerful from the theoretical point of view in the contribution to international relations scholarship. I also think that it gives us a way of thinking about how to address a particular set of challenges, I think in areas that we both find interesting, which is management of the global commons. These are areas that are areas beyond national jurisdiction. The class of course, is the seas, and we think about our oceans, but we can also think about our polar regions or indeed outer space. And indeed that how we think about the commons is helped by this idea that we could have a positive ultrasocial approach to these areas in particular. And these areas, I think, is particularly relevant for areas that are held in common. So indeed, under the 1967 Outer Space Treaty that we do hold, the moon is owned by all of us. Not that it's owned by none of us, it's owned by all of us. And so we need some frameworks to be able to address it. And as I say, one of the significance of the landing today is that we'll have increased activity on the moon, and we need to have some theoretical tools to help us understand that. I think your book will help us do that. So that's very exciting. And indeed, as we're facing with the sort of technological revolution, that these tools be particularly important as well. And it's a reminder that there have been aspects of cooperation, whether there was cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union at various points during the Cold War relating to space issues. And I think now that'll be important as well. I think there are elements that we can build out. One of them is one of the oldest principles in international relations, which is the responsibility to rescue. And indeed, if we think about the existence of the agreement on the rescue of astronauts, the return of astronauts, and the return of objects launched into outer space, that's direct relevance because we all have a shared common interest in being able to both safeguard each other, and actually all countries agree, the United States, China, then the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, have all signed that and recognize that there are fundamental human reasons why we need to cooperate and why our tendency is to help others in distress. It also means that if you collect the space hardware of another country, you need to return it. You don't get to keep it. So there are lots of fundamental principles that are helped here. So I think everything from the importance of the transcendent impact of inspirational and uplifting policy, from the importance of optimism that you outline, that we can do better, and finally, the idea that we can have a new narrative that is based on ultrasociality and positive cooperation in international relations is a powerful idea. And I thank you for bringing that and sharing that idea with us.
Thank you so much. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Divyansh to actually talk to us about, at the national level, the national policy making. Because of course, it's not just about conflicts between nation states. We also have just conflict between states and, here in the United States. So let's talk about what's happening at the national level.
I have a mic. How many of you were following what happened in Texas a couple weeks ago at Eagle Pass? So you know where I'm gonna go, more or less. But I'll take a step back and I'll start off from the international perspective and come to the national perspective. I think there was predominantly the thought in our country for about 3 decades after the Cold War that, any two countries with a McDonald's will never go to a war. After World War II, we were like, Europe's cheating on trade, whatnot. Sure, it's fine. Let them do it. If they have a better economy, it's fine. They won't fall behind the Iron Curtain. That's what we want. That's kind of the approach we took with China in the 1990s and whatnot. I think we all are seeing how that has impacted us. For the first time in so long, we have a near-peer adversary, not just militarily or geopolitically, but also economically, manufacturing-wise, that is not beholden to the international rule of law and is actively, engaging in what I would, what Professor Cross's book refers to as tribalism very well. And what happens then when you start thinking of a country as an economy in that perspective, when we started thinking about the United States as one that, hey, globalization is all good, all the products made for cheaper, whatever, consumers will consume them, some jobs will be lost, some better ones will be made, people with no degrees or not the right degrees, they'll have some job loss, we'll retrain them, whatever. That hasn't really worked out for us. nationally or internationally. I think at least as we are seeing, there's kind of a political realignment that has happened, as a result, where populist leaders across the world have risen up, who are like, hey, you, hardworking people, these people don't care about you. I am going to get up there. I don't need any money from these people. And these people, they would change every day. Like, one day it would be immigrants, one day it would be someone else, one day it would be someone else altogether. And I will get up there and I will fight them for you. And that was essentially kind of the message we saw in 2016. That's the message that defines American politics today to much extent as well. And then I think we had the pandemic, right? And we suddenly were like, oh, these masks are made in China, right? Where a lot of countries came together to produce those personal protective equipment that we used here. India sent oxygen cylinders or whatever. Like, the UK invented the AstraZeneca vaccine. India manufactured it, and the Quad countries gave it out to countries in Southeast Asia. So while there have been a lot of ramifications on the national side, because of how things have worked out on the international level, because of our engagement policies before, there is hope where we have interacted. And to come to my point that I was raising earlier, there's a massive refugee crisis in the world today, whether it's through climate or through conflicts or whatnot. And that's showing up not just here, but in Europe and the UK, now that they're not part of Europe. It's showing up in South Asian countries. And that's also fueling a lot of discontent in national politics and national policy making for a lot of people. And that's also a result of what we see, of leaders who rise up trying to persuade people, hey, follow me, they're the enemy, because they don't care about you. Not to mention the fact that we have historically low unemployment. Prime age working population is above 81%, the highest it has ever been. But hey, they're taking your job. So I think that happens, and we have to recognize, and I think the book very much does that, and does it really well when it tries to address why ultrasocialism is still the right way to think about things. And I think when you even look at, say, the space race, back when it was a space race, even during that time, the scientists were still talking. We tell ourselves the story that Sputnik came out of nowhere, but that's not the case. It was the International Geophysics Year, and we all knew the scientists who were working in space missions, they knew that the Russians were also working on something. Our folks were working on something. And, 1957 was going to be one of those years where somebody would develop. In fact, there was a conference happening in DC from September 30 to October 9th in 1957, where the Russians answered questions about their space program, saying that we are due to launch imminently. So it wasn't like that was a well-kept secret or anything, or anybody wanted to keep it a secret. Today, we look at so many track 1.5 and track 2 dialogues happening between US researchers and Chinese researchers on AI, which, everybody's like, well, if it's going to be a globally disruptive force for, both nationally and internationally, we need major powers to talk to each other. We may not agree with them on South China Sea, and believe me, I'm one of those people. But there are some things where standards are only going to be beneficial if, the second largest country adopts them as well, right? And I think that's where we are seeing some hope. We after the pandemic, we saw a slight decline in international students from China coming to the US. India became number one. But before that, the number of students coming from China to the US was really high. And that was one of our soft powers. Many of them would go back and tell how, a free society lives, how a free society prospers. And they would tell that story. They would, many of them would stay. Many of them would bring their families here because nobody wants to live in a regime that represses people, as we've seen with protests around whether it's COVID-0 or Hong Kong or anywhere. So I think there is a lot of nuance, and I think this book really tackles it very well. I think as one of the former prime ministers of India used to say, history will be the judge, and I think history probably doesn't judge the people who said no countries with McDonald's will go to a war ever. I'm sure Ukraine has McDonald's and Russia had some McDonald's, but I think history will judge this book pretty well.
Thank you. I was about to make a snarky comment about the beef tallow in the fryers for the fries, but we're not going to talk about that. Yeah. But with that, kind of understanding that you really can't divorce national policy from international relations because the boundaries are starting to blur. The boundaries are starting to fade as we have the largest mass movement of people in human history since the Ice Age. I mean, it's very difficult to really just disambiguate national and international. We're also finding that is also true at the urban scale. As an urban scholar, we are finding more and more cities taking on prominent role in international relations in particular, but also what is known in urban studies as globalism, that in order to be able to act locally, you have to be tapped in globally, and that they're just really tied together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Gloriela, to kind of tell us your perspective on the impact of this book.
Great. This is working. Awesome. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for coordinating, hosting this, Dr. Corley, and Mai'a, who has given me the permission to call her Mai'a, even though I feel like calling her Dr. Cross. I just want to thank you so much and echo the sentiments of Dr. Brimmer that this is just an astounding body of work. It feels insufficient to call it a book, and it's truly an amazing body of work. So thank you so much. And so I will be referring to my notes. So just that's just a disclaimer. But my name is Gloriela. I'm currently manager for Urban Heat, Health, and Equity at C40 Cities. And it felt really amazing to be able to read this book and apply it directly into my work right away, really. C40 Cities, just in brief, is a network of about 100 cities around the world that are committed, the mayors have committed to leadership standards to advancing climate action and climate policy at the local level, but also leveraging the networks that we have, whether it's around heat, extreme heat, air pollution, ports and shipping. And so they learn from other cities around the world, right? So it is this delicate balance and dance that you were talking about of the international informing the local and the local informing the international. And I just wanted to share what C40 Cities is all about, and I encourage you to learn a little bit more about it. Would be happy to chat with you about that later on. But I really wanted to focus on your book and how it has an application to the climate space, which I'm so happy that you wrote about that in your last case study. And I wanted to highlight a question that Mai'a raises in her book around how does this knowledge and body of evidence have a bearing on how we understand ourselves, and then also how we create potential futures for others, right? And I'll really be anchoring my reflections around that question. I'm also still grappling with the question, and will continue to, of what does ultrasociality mean for the future of climate action and the climate movement? And that will be an ongoing exploration for me, so thank you for that. So I will just start by mentioning the 4 ideas that really resonated with me from the book. It was not an exhaustive list. There are a lot of ideas that really resonated, but 4 that I think have an especially salient for my work and I think the climate space. So one was what Dr. Brimmer mentioned, the power of possibility. Second was the power of what I'm calling the committed, hopeful individual, and I'll get into that in just a second. The power of the collective we, right, and balancing and pairing that with the committed individual. And then lastly, the power of the conditions we create and foster, right, and that's where the agency comes in. And then I'll circle back into how these have a relevance to the work I've been doing at C40 and previously at MDRC, a social policy research space. So the power of possibility, I mean, you have already mentioned it and so have you, but I loved how you described it in your book as a common passion that a transformational idea, so one that has transcendent impact, for example, optimism, and provides a new narrative, has to incite across borders, and the grip that they gain on society's collective imagination. And I love that Dr. Cross, Mai'a, uses this as a bridge and as an encouragement, and then also exemplifies it through her case studies of how this has been used to transform institutions and policies, right? It goes from the idea into action. And I see that all the time in our work, right? How do we turn these transformative ideas into day-to-day implementation, right? And that's the bridge you were talking about, sometimes the gap that we experience. And I think also another thing I wanted to highlight is the importance of the unifying idea that you mentioned in your book, right? And that's where it comes in. In the context of the climate movement, Mai'a raises, quote, society galvanized behind that central idea of net zero, and it amplified the positive transformational narrative that it was achievable alongside economic growth and climate justice goals, right? And so something just, for me, I think others to ground ourselves in, right, that we have to always be investigating and interrogating ourselves about, is this a transactional idea, right? Are we in the business right now of, as you call it, very effective and efficient policy making, so it's not to undermine that, but when is it appropriate to go more into the transformational idea space, right? And when are we trying to mobilize people? The other is the power of the committed, hopeful individual, and also, usually the outsider, right? And I think you present that through the individuals you highlight. And I think, something that I was especially inspired by Jean Monnet from the European integration movement. And I love that you highlighted that he felt like he would have more influence as he stepped down from his position in the European coal and steel community. And he did. I mean, you can argue that he had a lot of influence, right? And that's something you do. And I love this, not just reminder, but encouragement that we each have power in the spaces that we occupy, right? We do not need to be in government positions in order to be able to influence and actually dictate the future of any given movement, right? It does take each and every one of us, and I think you make really, really great examples of that. And then the power of the collective we. I just want to highlight the fact that you had mentioned that the impetus for change first comes from global society, strong social support for eradicating previous policies of national self-interest is noticeably present in the lead up to significant and lasting policy change. So I think what I'll end with, and I'm not quite sure how long I have, and I'll just be transparent. Do I still have 2 more minutes? Okay, awesome. So I just want to connect it to the daily work that I do and that I've been doing for the past few years. And I think it really is under the umbrella of what you bring up, which is that change is not inevitable, right? We do need to act and act from a place of this grounded knowledge that we are ultrasocial, we are cooperative, we are empathic, but we need to bring that into action. And I, so much of kind of my professional experience so far and where I've been really passionate is thinking about how do we make our processes, our governance structures more democratic, right? More participatory, whether that's through research or that's through climate action or that's through advocacy and grassroots work. And so I'll just share maybe one example from this climate adaptation space that I think is very salient to the power of possibility, and maybe a few questions for us to consider and for all of you to consider in your work that I think goes beyond climate. So I've seen the salience of power of possibility and transformational ideas through a project especially that I worked on last year. It was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is the leading public health philanthropy in the U.S., and it was 6 U.S. city governments and community-based organizations that had to work together and be inspired by international examples, right? So even in the RFP, it was designed that they had to be in communication and dialogue with these international examples. And they had to be working at the intersection of climate adaptation and then how that was going to impact health outcomes in their local communities. And so I think one of the main takeaways that I think relates to your book, Mai'a, is this power possibility and the unifying idea was very, very present there. And I think one main takeaway was that it also, at least at the local level, and I would argue maybe at all levels, has to be rooted in an ongoing conversation and engagement with the people who live in the community and asking and starting from the premise of what are your, somebody's listening, what are your needs and what are your, what is it that you are missing, right? And also what are the strengths in your community and pairing those together, right? I think I'm left with this question of who is dictating the unifying idea? Who is part of determining the agenda for any given project or initiative that happens at the local level that then influences, of course, what happens at the national level. So I'll end there, but I'm excited to engage in conversation with all of you, and thank you again so much, Mai'a, for listening. There we go.
Sorry about that. So thank you so very much to each of you. And so now to give Mai'a an opportunity to kind of respond, and then I'll have you engage in some dialogue. But meanwhile, audience, as you're kind of like listening to these comments, kind of think of some questions you might want to ask of Mai'a, as well as any of the other discussants that are up here today. So Mai'a, what did you think?
Well, I'm so grateful that you really took it seriously and thought about how it applies in your various policy areas in your work. And I'm glad that it resonated in some way. And I thought I would just pick up a couple of points that each of you brought up, because it's also giving me food for thought and kind of gets back to Tracy's question about what would I add to the book, or what's next in terms of this type of thinking. Second, volume 2 of the Ultrasocial World. Esther, with the discussion you presented on space, of course, it's also of close interest to me, and I've been doing a lot of work in the area of space diplomacy. And I think you really highlighted the key challenge ahead, which is that we don't really have any frameworks that are up to date. So it's concerning on that level that we're kind of behind, and this happens a lot with technology revolutions, and we see it with AI as well. So, I mean, when I look at the overarching debate across the globe about what should the space frameworks be, it's a bit concerning, because some countries are threatening to sort of cross this line, which I think in a way is a taboo, of weaponizing space. And just very recently, Russia announced that it would do that, and I don't think it necessarily is going to do that, but it's concerning. And so we're at this critical juncture where we do actually need frameworks that stake a claim to space as a peaceful domain, that reaffirm things that, point towards space as a global commons. And when you have two competing narratives like that, the militarist one and the one that is about peace and science and exploration, it's hard to resolve. So I would hope that sort of thinking about the value of ultrasociality and how, why weaponize space when we can actually use it in a way, it almost is inherently this thing that unites us, because as the cover of the book shows, right, when you go out into space, astronauts have all reported feeling this overview effect. You're just astounded psychologically at the fact that we all exist on this one fragile planet. It is the only home that we have, and yet it contains all of this conflict and turmoil that seems like it wouldn't be necessary if we simply use our agency, our power of possibility, to think of ways of acting together when it comes to space. And then with Divyansh's comments as well, bringing up the biggest challenge right now in our world is China on so many levels. And, I would add to that Russia as well. So, how do you use an ultra-social lens when you're looking at two countries like this that are powerful, that have nuclear weapons, that seem to sort of like have no hesitation of issuing threats left and right all of the time? And, I think even there it is helpful to use this lens because, first of all, we have to separate the populations within these countries from the government, the tribalistic leader, right? And just recently with Navalny's death, right? Despite the risk, you saw Russian people from across this vast country coming out, risking arrest, and expressing their sadness. And so I think this is the hope. Even when things go wrong, how do people react? When Russia invades Ukraine, much of the world came together. That's where you focus on the possibility there. And then also with this idea of, the ongoing kind of conversations with local communities in the climate action. I mean, one thing I think was very apparent as I looked into the climate movement and how it grew and evolved, that it was really about like mayors and cities and localities, and the example of, having 3 cities move forward with funding to create a model for others to build on, and then you have a snowball effect. But I think the ongoing part is important as well, because ultrasociality ultimately is this long-term thing, right? You have to nurture it now in order to have those kinds of relationships and understandings in the future. You could try to approach something like, an immediate emergency of China threatening Taiwan with ultrasociality, but if you haven't built actually all the groundwork and the mutual understanding and the dialogue ahead of time, it would be hard to just sort of pull that out of the toolkit. So it's the ongoing side that you emphasize, which I think is a really important point.
So I've got a gazillion and a half more questions, but I do not want to go there. I want to see if there are any questions from the audience, comments from the audience. Because if not, we can continue the discussion up here. So, yeah, go ahead. Yes. Oh, actually, I'm going to give you my mic.
Thank you. Just the role of religion that plays in this context.
That's an interesting question, and I think it really illustrates how, you could go well beyond the cases of the book to think about ultrasociality. I would be interested to know what you're thinking, actually. I mean, off the top of my head, it does seem that there are many religions in the world that are appealing to the sense of common humanity, that bring people together, provide a sense of hope, that it is something that has come out of our sense of being a community that, is widespread. In many cases, religions are global, right? So there is that connecting thread. We also do see, looking at history, right, that religions have been used as a means to kind of promote violence, or sort of, there have been religious wars, right? So in some respects, depending on the case, it can actually stoke tribalism, I would say. So it kind of depends, I think, on the content and sort of the way in which people are sort of participating with religion. But I think it certainly is a manifestation of this kind of ultrasocial inclination. I hope I'm not causing this damage. Yeah. But if you wanted to respond as well in terms of what you're thinking, I'd be more than happy to.
I don't know that I've thought this through incredibly well, but it's just like anything else. Religion can, I think the basic tenets of most religions is to be empathetic and to be have others' interests at heart, and to but that can always be manipulated by charismatic leaders, and to reach the opposite effect. But that's my thought about that. Is that at its heart, religion is, but most religions are outward looking and
Yeah, and I would add to that, something I do say in the book is that, you can have us versus them in tribalistic movements, but you can also have in-groups that are so open and outward-looking that their goals, even though they are a group and they identify with one another, their goal is to expand their empathy and to be bigger, right, to really engage with the world.
I'll just add on to what you said. Like, I think, both of your points absolutely on point. I think other than religion, cuisine, one thing. The Thai government actually funds Thai restaurants to open up in the United States, so that if something were to happen to Thailand, the people in the U.S. would feel very empathetic about it. And back to religion, though, actually on cuisines, I highly recommend reading Cuisine and Empire. It's a book of how cuisines traveled across the globe and became cuisines of empires. But on the point of religion, I'll give you an example. I think everybody can agree, after the Middle East and the Taiwan Strait, probably India, Pakistan that's the hottest region right now, militarily, everything, I guess, they keep having skirmishes, to say the least. But they recently opened a corridor, visa-free corridor, for Sikhs to go from India to Pakistan, because they have a Sikh Gurdwara, a Sikh temple in Pakistan, which is very important to Sikhs in their religion, to visit that. And they opened a visa-free corridor for those people. And I think, despite all the tensions of terrorism or whatnot, there is a place where things like religion, cuisine, etc., they unite people, as long as, I suppose, you let them practice.
And I have to say that when I was reading this book, I couldn't help but think about religious philosophy, and what it does is it kind of changes the way we think about interpretation, because there are these underlying threads of empathy and pro-social values in every single religion that's out there. But just thinking about, for example, the word warrior in the Christian context versus the Buddhist context. You have the warrior as destroyer versus the warrior as protector. And what does that mean? When your warriors are designed to be peacemakers and are trained to not draw their weapons, to be in Germany with police officers who rarely carried weapons, and when they did, they very rarely ever drew them, versus being here in the United States and you have people getting shot for sleeping in their cars. So, this is, I think, this kind of conversation and thinking about all those things that tie us together, rather than the interpretations that divide us apart. I think the question about religion and thinking about those underlying values that bring us together versus the dogma that keeps us apart, I think it does kind of open up the conversation a lot, as to thinking about how we interpret different words. I mean, even in the work, working with communities, both Gloriela and I work very closely in communities with people who are fighting for justice, but just getting people to agree to the same definition of justice. That kind of coming to these kind of common understandings that are rooted in ultrasocial principles and values, as opposed to focusing in on, well, for me, justice is making sure you don't come on my property. We need to make sure that we have those ultrasocial principles at the fore. So it's not just religion, it's just really interpretation of words and language and all the other things that kind of underlie some of our religious tenets in different religions around the world.
So I'm curious, how can societies help to redirect the tribalism at a faster pace? Because I really would like to see that happen in a lot of places.
Well, first, thank you for the question. If I may pick up on a point that you made, and since we're sitting at an educational institution, to talk about the importance of international education. one of the things we can do is study and learn together in institutions like this and institutions around the world. And I think one of the most important, trends globally is to study in another country or with people from another country. And that has profound impact on people's friendships, lives, and understanding the world around them. And so I think it's important to see the efforts to reconnect, for example, after the pandemic, and to see the effort to try to get students and scholars back into programs around the world. And I think that's one of the most important developments of the past 75 years has been the expansion of international education. I think it will be important for the 21st century as well.
No, I agree with what was said. I 100% agree. I just wish, that I think to your question on like how we accelerate it, I think there's no easy solution that comes to my mind. Like I have two portfolios in my work. One's on AI and emerging tech, and one's on China. Nothing really happening in either. I sleep peacefully at night. I think about this like almost on a daily basis. Like, how do we make sure that, how do we get to a place where, I'm holding a pen in my hand that was made in Japan. Probably nobody could have fathomed that during the Second World War, right? And it's going to take a lot of time, but it's not something we can do. Right, we can't do a regime change, in the PRC. That's up to the people over there. But we also can't wait for that to happen. And so, till then, I think we have to make the most of what we have. Try to make the most of the world we're living in, or like trying to make the most of the PRC that we're dealing with today than the one we would like to deal with, right? And I think that acceptance and is one big motivational factor for me to try and change things tomorrow, to get back up tomorrow and see what we can do. I think you can find all that I've written about China on those issues, but like at the end of the day, like, it's not, as Professor Cross mentioned, the issue is not with the people. The issue is with it's a competition of ideologies. It does not mean we give up on capitalism and become more like China. We stay strong to our way, that is about like working with others, working with our partners and allies. The reaction matters a lot. Like the reaction to tribalism is, I think, what book hits so well is an example of that ultrasocialism. How countries that would otherwise be non-aligned are now joining a quadrilateral security dialogue, or South Korea and Japan are making peace with each other because they're recognizing a common threat. I think that is addressing tribalism in response to someone else picking up tribalism.
What you're saying, but I mean, one reality is there's always going to be some element of tribalism in different forms around the world. Looking at the course of human history, I do think it's more like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that the progress, the ultrasociality, it gets increasingly embedded in our institutions, so it makes it harder for severe tribalism to rise up. But we might right now be in the period of the 1 step back. And I think I do find hope in the fact that, as Divyansh just described, there is an ultra-social backlash to this. You see it time and time again. Thinking back to 2016, right, there was the Women's March, and it was echoed throughout the world in sister marches. Same with the Black Lives Matter movement. So it is quite challenging once people are swayed by sort of manipulative leaders to get them out of that sphere. It isn't easy, but you can nurture the ultra social side and inspire people so they don't kind of get drawn into these in the future. And I think that it comes back to the point about some ideas matter more ultimately, right? Some ideas tap into how we would like to be cooperative and show empathy. And so that's where I see the hope. But yeah, it is definitely not a straightforward thing at the same time.
I also wanted to add, Gloria in a second. But I also want to add that, talking about like tribalism and kind of leveraging ultrasociality, there's the whole component of actually what you mentioned in the book about the paradox of choice. I just love that you quoted Alvin Toffler, who I remember reading back in high school many decades ago. I'm thinking, about like future shock of when you have too many choices, when things are happening too fast, people kind of like just take comfort in conformity. They kind of really just kind of rest on their heels because it's like there's just too much going on. I think that that's one thing that we just need to be very aware of just things moving too fast and people not being able to keep up. And the other thing is that, it's really hard to like care about the moon landing when people are starving. If you can't feed your children, if you can't actually afford healthcare, you really do not care about what's happening in space. So I think that we need to actually be leveraging the ultrasociality principles and values to actually make sure people's basic needs get met. And then I think that that's how we get to like a more cooperative, empathic world more quickly.
Totally agree. I'm so glad you mentioned that, Tracy. And just to add on to what others were saying, to your question about how do we address tribalism, I'm really glad you posed it. And at first I was like, But I think one hopeful spot that I have been learning about and listening to in the past few months is, you talked about the Global Commons, but there are several organizations that are working on reclaiming the public spaces that we have in the U.S. And that to me is, it gives me so much hope, and it's happening right now, right? There are several, the Project for Public Spaces, Urban Institute is also working on several research projects, and there is one specifically focused on public commons as a way to increase civic engagement and democracy, right? That is their theory of change. Mississippi, I think, was one of the most recent places that made this massive investment in having a waterfront public park that brings people together with that intention, right? The intentionality is so important that is one of your priorities when creating public spaces and leveraging our urban planning, right, in a way that prioritizes that. It's not just about having beautiful glass buildings. It's what are the people doing there? How are we making sure that we can leverage architecture and urban planning in a way that people from different ethnicities and genders and ages can interact with each other? And so that has been giving me a lot of hope, and it's in practice right now. So I think that's something we can continue to encourage and invest in to any funders and philanthropies out there. But yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say that, in urban theory, I love Louis Betancourt's conceptualization of the city as an agglomeration of human interactions. You get away from the systems and the trains and the water supply. You actually talk about people connecting because it's where people settle thickly that creates urbanism. And I just love the fact that your book just really focuses in on human interactions. But I'm also, my spidey sense is telling me that we're getting close to time. I want to make sure that there's someone who's been... Oh, you have but we have someone also with a question in the audience. And so, let's go ahead and take your question, and then Esther, I'll let you go first. So.
Okay, great. Something that's kind of related to tribalism is, the current mental health crisis. And so something I've been thinking about is if we are so ultrasocial, why are psychologists saying that we're lonelier than ever? Is it maybe proof that we are ultrasocial? And I just wanted to get your thoughts on mental health.
Go ahead and maybe do your follow-up to the last question, and then I'll let Mai'a weigh in on that final question for us.
Okay, great. I wanted to pick up on one of the uses of technology and the uses of space. One of the reasons that we care is access to information. One of the fact that we can have weather information, that we can have educational information, the access to the internet. And overcoming the digital divide. The importance of the choices we make is how do we then bring the benefits of this technology to everybody? And obviously we have a long way to go, but understanding that we're all part of that same system is crucial. And I'll go back to the overview effect. Indeed, one of the great contributions of that vision is the beginning of the environmental movement as a public movement, recognizing this is the only planet we have, and we're responsible, all of us, for looking after it.
To add to that, I am really aware of this kind of debate over should we be pursuing exploration of space when we have so many problems on Earth. And I'm quite convinced of the fact that ultimately, all of these advancements in space actually do help to solve problems, mitigating climate change, health concerns that can be sort of resolved through experiments that you can only conduct in space. And so I would definitely advocate doing both, right? Solving the problems on Earth, but using these discoveries in space to leverage doing that even better, just as Esther said. And it is, yeah.
Much of the technology we see today was a result of our innovation for the space program, investments in the space
Star Trek.
Battlestar Galactica here, actually. But I think your question is so important. It goes. Oh, sorry.
Oh, well, and then you can go as well. I mean, absolutely. It's so important. And I think in the book, I cite one study that says being alone every day is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes. That's how bad it is for the human body. And so many scientists are saying that Maslow's hierarchy of needs to be reversed, because we actually need social interaction more than we need food and water in some respects. And when you do see a mental health crisis, and some of it is stemming from loneliness, I think, this is this part of it, that we crave ultrasociality, we crave human contact, we want to be in a society, and it has to be in person too, despite what happened with the pandemic. So, but I'll let Divyansh pick this up as well.
I was just going to tie back what I was talking about earlier. When we start thinking about people as just consumers, I think a lot of what we are seeing in terms of the crisis around loneliness is a result of that. It's I think an unintended byproduct of neoliberalism, where we've decided that globalization is great in every respect, the people who used to work those jobs in manufacturing in Dayton, Ohio, are perhaps they will retrain into something else, into IT jobs and then into AI jobs and whatever. When those towns lose their biggest employers because they move the factories to China or Vietnam or wherever, because it's cheaper to produce there, because we let that happen. We're like, hey, we want cheaper goods, right? That causes a lot of tension, right? Like that, there is a pride in being the breadwinner, right? Or earning what you're making through hard work and labor. Like, you could have all kinds of social welfare schemes that they will not compensate for that feeling that you bring when your paycheck comes to you. When you work in that mom and pop store that defines the characteristic of that of the street, in your town, or the small auto parts store that's now closed because we've got all these massive big chains coming in because it's more efficient, right? To some aspects, like economically, that makes sense, but like there are other effects that we did not account for in economics. And that is like, I think, there's only one person actually making a case for this in town, and he's been writing very well on this issue. I highly recommend reading Senator Murphy's views on the politics of loneliness. And I think, he's actually the only lawmaker who's introduced legislation to have a policy response to the loneliness crisis that we're facing as a result of our failed economic policies. I mean, we saw a massive response to our failed economic policies in 2016. I think other countries are seeing them as well. And now we are finally realizing, oh, we actually probably do need an industrial strategy. We don't let Vietnam make F-35s, even though probably it would be economically efficient. We do have industrial strategy in areas where we care about, where there are other interests at play than just economic efficiency. And so there are other interests at play even in these situations where we need to re-examine how we think about economics.
Just to kind of build on that is I think that we've also gotten to the point where in our society we see all human interactions as market exchanges. We've tried to marketize all human interactions, and I think the pandemic showed us when people refused to go back to work because they started to realize that, A, being a part of the labor market, being a part of, a very commodified life is not everything to life. That to kind of like one of the things that ultrasociality brings us back to is thinking more broadly about human relations and not just about economic exchange. And so I think with that I think we're way over time. And so with that, I'm gonna close this out. Oh, you're supposed to be our timekeeper.
So interesting.
Sorry. Okay, our timekeeper actually gets the final question, and then we're shutting it down. So go ahead.
It's for the panel and especially Professor Cross. I haven't read the book and I'm very excited to read it, but the discussion today is making me think about how ultrasociality draws from indigenous wisdom and indigenous conception of ways of living. Like harmony is at the center of all the indigenous concepts and principles. I wonder if you came across that in your book or if any other panelist has any comments on that.
That's a great, tough question. Would you like to start? I could do the last.
If I may ask you a question, then related to that. To say that I think, because one of the interesting things is that you grew up in the state of Hawaii.
Yes, I'm actually an indigenous person.
And I was just going to say, maybe share the richness of our 50th states, because I think that may be part of your worldview, but I wouldn't presume, but I think that we used to go out to Hawaii a lot for a variety of reasons. And one of my father went to the University of Washington in Seattle. One of his good friends was a lady who became the state historian, Jane Silverman. She was the state historian. And so I used to go out and hang out with her, one of the coolest women I ever met. I was like a teenager. But what she was talking about was, again, the importance of history and culture. And so I just wanted maybe share some of that in response to this question, because that's all about our being.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I feel a little bit put on the spot because it crosses over beyond my scholarly work to part of my identity as well as Native Hawaiian. But yeah, I think what you're pointing out is incredibly important. We can learn from indigenous communities, and when I think of Hawaii and kind of the shifts in how Hawaiians have welcomed visitors to the islands has been important, because there are these historic caricatures, right? And rather than just simply trying to correct the caricature, the approach has been to engage in cultural diplomacy and cultural exchange, and to say that, this is about understanding that the society of this indigenous community is open and welcoming, and it's about two-way interaction, mutual understanding. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And one thing that also has quite resonated with me recently, learning a little bit more about Native Hawaiian history and everything, is that the Hawaiians were one of the early people to be incredibly international, right? When they sailed and learned how to use the stars for navigation, they were eager to go to Europe. They were eager to learn from those all over the world and bring back some of the things that they admired culturally home, and instilled this sense among the public that it is good to learn to read universally and to learn and embrace all these ideas from different places, that that there is this sense of human progress that really can be valuable in everything that is done there. So, I mean, these are just more personal reflections on the way this works, because I'm an IR scholar who does security and nuclear weapons in space. But I think that it's an important element to bring in another way that we can really listen to.
Say thank you so very much to all of our discussants and to Mai'a for coming tonight and sharing the book with us. thank you to all of you. I also want to say thank you so much to Regional Dean Jamie Jones-Miller, as well as to the entire staff here at the campus. I see Rana Hobgebox, our Associate Dean is here. I think there are a number of folks, but there's also our security team is here. But I also want to say the operations team has been absolutely amazing helping us get this event set up today. And I also want to say thank you to the folks back in Boston in our dean's office. We have some folks here tonight, including Daryl Lamar, but also the folks in Alumni Affairs and the dean's office who've been helping us put together this event. And of course, my team here. There's Manushi Sharma, our program assistant, and Charlene Joost, who is our associate director of student services and recruitment. Thank you all for all of the hard work that you put in tonight to make sure that this event could happen. And thank you to all of you for coming. Please grab a book. Grab some food. It'll be there until 8. And so until then, everyone online, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you all next time. Thanks.
I'll bring one here. Okay. Thank you.